All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our installment of the Summer Survivor Speaker Series. Today, we're going to hear from Mr. Ron Schwarz, who will tell you about his father's experience during the Holocaust. But before we begin, I just wanted to give a couple thank yous. First, to our sponsor for the Summer Survivor Speaker Series, Ernst & Young, LLP. Thank you so much for your ongoing support. And of course, to our community partners for this series, Avance North Texas, Communities Foundation of Texas, Educational First Steps, Faith Forward Dallas, George W. Bush Presidential Center, International Rescue Committee in Dallas, Legacy Senior Communities, Reach of Dallas, SMU Human Rights Program, and the Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission. Thank you again for your support, as always. So Ron's going to speak for just about 45 minutes, and then we will have plenty of time for question and answer. I will go ahead and ask you to locate your Q&A button. It's probably going to be at the bottom of your screen if you're on a computer or tablet, or it might be up at the top. So at any point during the program, if you have a question, you can go ahead and type it in there, and we will get to those at the end. I'll be back to moderate that session. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ron Schwarz.
Okay, well, thank you, Annie. As she told you, I'm Ron Schwarz, and I have a story to share with you today. It's about my father and what it was like for him as a Jew growing up in Germany and how he survived the war, and also a bit about my grandparents and how they endured the Nazis in Germany and what their experience was also. So the story begins for me in Ludwigshafen, Germany in 1925. Ludwigshafen is about 60 or 70 miles south of Frankfurt. In the middle 20s, Germany, things are better in Germany. They're starting to recover from World War I. They're exporting a lot of products. Life is really becoming decent again. Ludwigshafen has a Jewish population of about 1,400 and not huge, but big enough to have a synagogue. And in fact, you can see on the top left over here and over here is a picture of the synagogue in Ludwigshafen from the 1920s. My grandparents owned a watchmaker shop jewelry store. This is a picture of the street where the store was located, and you can see over on the right, this clock. This was the store right here. And they lived across the street over here. I'm not sure exactly which building it is in this picture. This is also a picture from the 1920s of the street. My grandparents got married in 1925, and then my father was born about 10 months later in January of 1926. While my father is in the hospital, an ex-employee actually, walked into the jewelry store and talked to my grandfather about coming back to work. He used to work there. He wasn't anymore. He wanted to come back to work. They agreed that he would start work the following Monday. And then the guy took out a gun, shot my grandfather in the chest, killing him, shot two other employees in the store, but they both survived. They were just superficial wounds. And then he turned the gun on himself and he killed himself. This is the article from the newspaper the next day. And you can see what the headline says: "A terrible bloody act, 2 dead and 2 injured on Prenzry Gettenstrasse." And that's the name of the street where the store was. My grandmother, I can't imagine what this was like for her. She's 25 years old. She's in the hospital still, in the maternity ward. She's got a 7 or 8 day old son. And now she's a widow, and she's got a jewelry store to run. I mean, It just must have been terrible for her. But life goes on. About 3 years later, my grandmother remarried. She remarried a man named Oscar Schwarz. That's why I'm a Schwarz. This page on the left here is it's a page from an address book from Ludwigshafen from the 1930s. And you can see here that it says Oscar, it's Oscar Schwarz. This is in the Schwarz category. KFM is Kaufmann, it means businessman. And this is the address where they live, the Prinz Regentenstrasse, number 65. Life is actually pretty good in Germany now. And things are good, quite honestly, until they're not. Let's listen to my father talk a little bit about going to school and life in Germany.
In the, I don't know about the first year, but certainly in the second, third year and beyond that, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the school. In other words, the kids called me Saujude, which is German for Jew pig. And I remember that the teacher really didn't take any action. I mean, he was not openly antagonistic towards me, but he certainly made no attempt whatsoever to curb the other children.
So that's my dad. He's a cute little guy, isn't he? I think the thing that's really important that he said, and that's important to note, is that even before Hitler came to power, there's already anti-Semitism in Germany and in the schools and negative feelings towards Jews. So Hitler comes to power in 1933. He gets named Chancellor of Germany. I think it's important to note that Hitler came to power strictly by legal means. There was no military takeover. There was no coup d'etat. It was, completely within the laws of Germany. To appreciate the appeal of Hitler, and they teach entire courses on this in universities. I'm going to give you the 30-second overview. By 1933, the economic situation in Germany is awful. It's really dire. There is a lot of unemployment. There is a lot of inflation. I told you, in the mid-20s, Germany was doing well. Well, by the time the Depression hit in the United States, things went south in Germany as well. So Hitler, he comes to power and he's saying two things. He's saying that I'm going to give everybody a job. I'm going to rebuild the military infrastructure and everyone's going to have work. And the reason that we're bad off now and that things aren't good here is because of the Jews and what they have. And the Jews were really easy to blame, and both of these things really resonated in Germany. So Hitler comes to power in 1933. He quickly consolidates power. About two and a half years later, 1935, Germany passes the Nuremberg Laws. The Nuremberg Laws were for the protection of German blood and honor. And it imposed a lot of restrictions, both socially and economically, on the Jews in Germany. For example, Jewish officers were expelled from the army. German court judges couldn't cite commentaries by Jewish authors. It defined who was a Jew and who was a German. It removed citizenship, German citizenship, from the Jews in Germany. So even if you were born and raised in Germany in 1935, if you were Jewish, you were no longer German. You were actually stateless. So again, a lot of restrictions imposed on on the Jews by the Nuremberg Laws. And I have this article here or this page from the New York Times talking about the Nuremberg Laws. And I think it's important to note that if it's in the New York Times, this wasn't just local news in Germany. The whole world knew that this was happening. Let's listen to my father talk about some of the life with some of these laws and decrees.
In the meantime, additional decrees came out limiting the movement of Jews. For instance, I recall we couldn't go anymore to the park where we used to go because the benches in the park had signs, no Jews are allowed. It was difficult to travel because hotels had signs, no dogs and no Jews. As a side comment, after World War II, the Germans liked to go to the shore in Holland, and since the Dutch had suffered quite a bit under the German occupation, the hotels on the shore in Holland had signs, no dogs and no Germans.
Yeah, you can tell my father, he really liked that story. You could hear him kind of chuckle at the end. He actually used to tell me that story a lot as a kid, and he would laugh. He really liked it. One of the important things that my father said at the beginning was new decrees kept coming all the time. I will tell you that in all, the Nazis passed something like 400 laws and decrees restricting the life of Jews in Germany. And that was just at the national level. In addition to that, individual municipalities passed their own laws and restrictions and decrees. Everything kind of came to a head in November of 1938 in what is known as Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht means we call it the night of the broken glass. And what happened was that civilians and some paramilitary soldiers, they went through the country and they broke into stores that were owned by Jews. They broke the windows. They went in. They completely trashed the stores. They broke into Jewish apartments and homes, broke down the doors, trashed the furniture, in many cases beat up Jewish residents. They burned down all of the synagogues in Germany. So this right here in the middle, this is a picture of the synagogue that I showed you earlier in Ludwigshafen, and you can see here even the smoke coming out of the synagogue. They arrested, I think, 30,000 Jews. They sent them to concentration camps. A lot of them went to Dachau. This is a picture of Jews that were interned at Dachau during Kristallnacht. My grandfather was arrested. And sent to Dachau. My father's going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. And this is the front page of the Dallas Morning News. After Kristallnacht, hysterical Nazis wrecked thousands of Jewish shops, burned synagogues in wild orgy of looting and terror. Again, I think it's really important to note and understand there's international knowledge about what's happening in Germany. Let's listen to my father talk a little bit about Kristallnacht.
We were spared. They never came to our apartment, nor did they destroy the store. And they told my parents later on that since we had a jewelry store and there was a lot of gold in there, that they considered that to be state property, and therefore it was not their intention of destroying it. They picked up my dad, and for several days we didn't really know where he had been sent to. My mother went to the Gestapo office every day to find out what the status was, and I gather they were civil to her, and she finally found out that he had been sent to Dachau.
So Kristallnacht confirmed for Jews in Germany that Germany really wasn't safe for them anymore if they had any doubts. Parents were trying to get their children out of the country to safety. They wanted to get out themselves too, but they wanted to save the children first. It was arranged for my father to leave Germany and go to Paris. More on that in a minute, but first my grandparents had to deal with another situation. The Nazis issued a law at the beginning of 1939. It was basically a name change requirement. And what it said was that all Jewish men had to change their name by adding the name Israel to their name. And all Jewish women had to change their name by adding the name Sarah to their name. Why would they do this? I think two reasons. One, if you then see that someone's name is Israel or Sarah, it immediately identifies them as a Jew. And also, I think it's part of the dehumanization process that the Nazis imposed on the Jews. You know, if everyone has the same name, you lose your identity. You're no longer unique. You're no longer special. This document in the middle is my grandparents' marriage certificate. And you can see these notations on the right over here with the red box. These notations were not original in the marriage certificate. What happened was the Nazis went through the civil register, found marriage certificates involving Jews, and then they made this notation for the man that he has now added Israel to his name. And if it was a woman, like this about my grandmother, she has now added Sarah to her name. In February of 1939, my grandparents get a letter. It's this letter here. Notice it's addressed to Oscar Israel Schwarz. And this subject line talks about the elimination of Jews from German economic life. So at the beginning of 1939, this was another decree. Jews were essentially no longer allowed to be involved in a trade or a business. And the letter says that the store had to be liquidated, the jewelry store. It ordered my grandfather to do an inventory, which he did. It's about a 15-page inventory. I have it. It lists every item in the store and the value of that item. The Nazis then brought in their own guy, this guy, Richard Albrecht, and he reviewed my grandfather's inventory and said, no, I don't agree with it. This is too high. This is too high. And he sort of shot down the value of the inventory of the store. You'll notice this letter is signed Heil Hitler. I want to tell you, I have hundreds of pages of documents on my father and grandparents. I've been through archives. I've probably read through thousands of pages of documents, and nothing resonated with me and upset me as much as seeing this Heil Hitler on this letter. It really, I mean, we knew it would be true, and of course he would write that. I mean, the guy was a Nazi, and that's what they wrote, but it really upset me to see that. Anyway, so there's a value of the store that they come up with. There was a guy who wanted to buy it. My grandfather entered into a contract with this guy to buy the jewelry store. In that purchase document, this is from the purchase document translated into English, the purchase price is to be paid immediately after approval by the trade office and on the blocked account of the German state bank in Ludwigshafen. So this buyer paid the money into this account, but the account was blocked. So what that means is my grandfather never got the money for the store. So essentially the store was just taken away from him and the Nazis kept the money. This was really pretty typical in Germany with Jewish businesses that were seized, that the Jews never really saw the money. So while my grandparents are dealing with this seizure of the jewelry store, that's when my father is sent to France. So he comes home from school one day and he is told that he's going to France the next day. He's getting on a train and they're sending him out of the country. His parents were not going with him. My father didn't speak French at the time, and he was going alone. And I can't imagine how scary that was for my father as a 13-year-old. I mean, try to imagine that, what that was like for his parents to put him on that train. Imagine putting your 13-year-old child on a train or a plane and sending him out of the country. His parents didn't know if they would ever get out. They did end up escaping from Germany, but they didn't know that at the time. They didn't know if they would survive, if he would survive. I mean, this had to be terribly, terribly scary for them. My father gets sent to a place called Chateau de la Guette. It's outside of Paris. These are pictures, this top right and top left. Those are pictures taken at La Guette of my father when he was 13 or 14 years old. This is actually a schedule of instruction of classes at La Guette. And what's important here, I think, is this from 2:30 to 4:30 in the afternoon, activité en plein air, which is outdoor activities. So a lot of play. They wanted these kids, they were trying to get them into really good physical shape. And couture is sewing, ménage is housework. They're teaching these kids survival skills. So they don't know what's coming down the pike. It's May of 1939. The war hadn't started yet, but everybody anticipated that there would be war, and they don't know what they're going to have to do with these kids, but they're preparing these kids for survival and, again, being in good physical shape. Let's listen to my dad talk about leaving Germany.
1939, I was taken to the railroad station, and with a group of 100, maybe 200 kids, we took the train for Paris. When we got to Paris, originally, we were sent to the Rothschild hospital because apparently they had enough rooms and beds available to accommodate everybody, and there we were sorted out and sent to various children hostels. I was sent to a place called Chateau de la Guette, which was about 50 miles east of Paris. It was, I don't know whether it was owned by the Rothschilds or whether they had rented it, but we were 136 kids, all from Germany and Austria. We were very well taken care of there. In other words, we had nice accommodations. We were adequately fed.
Okay, so yeah, so he's at Chateau de la Guette. He's there for a while. Chateau de la Guette starts filling up. He gets sent to another boarding school in just outside of Paris. Okay. In May of 1940, Germany invades France, and when Germany invaded France, you can see this map on the right. They didn't occupy the whole country. They occupied the northern. You can see the demarcation line. They occupied the northern part of country as well as the Atlantic coast. Everything else to the, underneath that demarcation line. I mean, it was a collaborative government, but it still was not occupied by the Germans. My father's now at this boarding school. The director of the school says, we have to get, the Germans are here, they're coming, and we have to get out of here. And you can see this this picture here is a picture of a train platform in 1940. I mean, nobody wanted to stay in Paris. Nobody wanted to stay in the German occupied part of France. Lots of people are trying to flee. It was chaotic. The director of the school where my father was owned an estate outside or in Poitiers, and decides he's going to take all the kids in the school to this estate in Poitiers. Let's listen to my father talk about leaving Paris.
The director of the school, or the owner of the school, owned an estate near Poitiers, which is sort of halfway between Paris and Bordeaux. When the Germans were basically at the doors of Paris, he decided to evacuate the whole school to Poitiers, and we took the train from Paris to Poitiers. It was quite an experience because everybody was fleeing, and the trains were sort of crowded. I mean, there was barely room to stand, and they were slow, but we finally made it.
So they get to Poitiers. The problem with Poitiers is in the occupied part of France. So it really wasn't any safer or more desirable than being in Paris. So they only stayed in Poitiers for a couple of months, and then the director took everybody back to Paris. At that point, La Guette is closing down, and all the La Guette kids got sort of distributed to different places in France. My father got sent to a place in Bourboule called Hôtel des Anglais, and Bourboule is in the unoccupied part of France, so that is more desirable to be there. But I have to tell you, it was not easy to cross that demarcation line. I mean, the Germans, they had checkpoints on all the roads, and and you needed papers. My father never knew how they got the papers. He assumed that they were, the papers were counterfeit. But the Germans didn't make it easy to cross into the unoccupied zone. Some people were killed trying to do that. Others were shot at. Not my father and not his group, but people were. Anyway, they get to La Bourboule. It's the winter of 1941, and it was a tough winter. Let's listen to my father talk about being in La Bourboule.
It was a very harsh winter for us. Food was severely rationed, and the things that were not rationed, just like vegetables, just were not available. Then it was very cold and snowy, lots of snow, very cold in winter, and there wasn't enough coal or wood to heat the place. We had minimal heating in the dining room and in the bedroom and in the classrooms. We had zero heat in the bedrooms, and of course we were constantly hungry. There just wasn't enough to eat. One of the people we were 5 or 6 in each bedroom. One of the people in our room was a very tall and strong guy, and I remember he once went during the day, in the evening rather, into the mountains and into one of the barns, and he stole a 50 kilo bag of oats that were kept there to feed the horses. And he brought it back, and we were eating the oats, which were horse meal. And I remember I had a shoebox, and I filled that with oats, and I kept it under my bed.
So horse meal, I mean, they ate horse meal, right? You did what you had to do to survive. By the way, 50 kilograms is 110 pounds. So this is a significant bag of oats. My father stayed in La Bourboule for about 7 months. He got moved around to a bunch of different places. He probably, the whole time he's in France, he's probably lived in 10 different places. And I want to tell you, he's getting ready to escape France and go to Switzerland, and we're going to talk about that. But before we get into that, I want to tell you what's going on in France while he's there. He ends up staying in France until October of 1942. In May of 41, okay, a year and a half before he leaves, they start arresting Jews and rounding up Jews and, basically incarcerating them. In March of 1942, the deportations to the camps start. So in 1942, they start deporting Jews from France, mostly to Auschwitz. And so, you listen to my father, and he's talking about cold winters and not having enough food and not having enough heat. But understand, he's in hiding in France, essentially. If he gets found out and picked up, he's going to get sent to Auschwitz. So he's in hiding for a year and a half, which really explains probably why he moved around so much and lived in 10 different places, right? The more he moved around, the better chance he had of surviving. Maybe the most famous example of that is Anne Frank, who, was hidden in one place and, ultimately got discovered. So the end of 1942, October 42, it's decided that France isn't safe for these Jewish kids. They're going to help them escape to Switzerland. My father and 3 friends get on a train and head to the city of Annemasse. Annemasse is in France, but it's on the border with Switzerland. It's about 6 or 7 miles from Geneva, one of the biggest cities in Switzerland. The train ride to Annemasse, my father said, was really scary. He said there were soldiers everywhere. They kept checking your papers. When you got to Annemasse, he said you couldn't get out of the train station without showing your papers. He has no idea where they got his papers. Again, he assumed these papers were counterfeit. He and his friends get to Annemasse. They're met by a man in the station. He takes them to a safe house. They hide out in the safe house until 2 or 3 in the morning. He then takes them to the border. They wade across this river, this small river, and now they're in Switzerland. And I'm going to tell you what happened in Switzerland, and you're going to listen to my dad. But I want you to think about how terrifying this journey had to be. Okay. If they get caught, they have nowhere to go in France anymore. And if they get caught or picked up, they're going to be sent to Auschwitz. There's no doubt they would be deported. Anyway, so now they're in Switzerland. They start walking. They actually get picked up by a Swiss border guard. Listen to my father talk about this crossing into Switzerland.
Anyhow, we took off our shoes and socks and pulled up our pants, and we got across the barbed wire and that little river, and on the other hand we sat down, we put back our shoes and socks, and at that point that we were already in Switzerland at the other side of the river of Switzerland. At that point, we were caught by a Swiss border guard. As I said, there were 4 of us. He took us to a sort of entry post where we were asked our names and date of birth. We had nothing on us. In other words, no baggage, just the clothes that we were wearing. We had 0 money, neither French nor Swiss. We had no papers whatsoever. So whatever information we gave them, they had to accept at face value. They asked for our date of birth, and 3 of us were born in 25 or 26, and 1 was born in 1927. And they announced that they would not keep children over the age of 16, and the boss asked one of the border guards to take us back to the border and to ship us back across the border into France. They kept the 4th one, who was born in 1927. He took us back to the border. Turn off a second. So he took us back to the border and he said, this is France across that little river, and you need to go back. Geneva is in this direction, and I don't know what you're going to do when I'm on my way back. So we waited till he had gotten back, and then we headed towards Geneva.
So this Swiss soldier, what an incredibly wonderful thing he did. He essentially let them stay in Switzerland by turning his back and walking away. There were a lot of people who did decent things during the war, to, save not just Jews, but lots of people. And we call those people upstanders. And that Swiss soldier is a great example of an upstander. By the way, I just imagine when the boss, as my father called him, tells them they have to go back to France, I can't imagine what that was like for them to hear that. I mean, they make this train journey to Annemasse. They, they cross the border. They're in Switzerland. And again, like I told you, they had nowhere to go in France. If they got shipped back to France, they would get picked up and deported to Auschwitz. So I can't imagine what it was like for them hearing the boss say you have to go back to France. But thankfully, what a great upstander that soldier was. Anyway, they're in Switzerland. They hike into Geneva. They had the name of a pastor there that had helped refugees, and they found him. The pastor gave them breakfast. My father said he couldn't believe how much food there was in Switzerland. He told them to take the tram and go to the police station and just tell them you're here and tell them that you're 15 years old. And he gave them money to take the tram. They go to the police station. The police send them to a refugee camp. My father said it wasn't deluxe, but there was more food there than in France. And from there, the kids got distributed out to different children's homes. My father, again, probably was in 8 or 9 different children's homes. And I want to say, though, even though he's in Switzerland and he's safe, right? Switzerland's neutral. They're not in the war. He's not going to get deported to a camp. He's safe, but his life there still isn't easy. He's not a citizen of Switzerland. He's a refugee, and there are a lot of restrictions on him. So, like, for example, he would get sent from children's home to children's home where he would work. They would pay him money to work, not a lot, but some. He could keep half the money, and then half the money would be put into a bank account for him. And every time he wanted any of that money, he had to write a letter to the police and request it, and tell them why he wanted it. Sometimes they said yes, sometimes they said no. But every time he got to a new town, he had to sign a statement saying that there were all kinds of requirements on him. Like, he wasn't allowed to leave the city without getting permission from the police. He wasn't allowed to get together in groups of more than 5. He had a curfew. There were about 16 or 17 rules that he had to abide by, and he had to sign the statement every time he changed cities. This letter, so one of the places my father was in Langenbruck, in Switzerland, he was in a children's home, and they hired him to work in the kitchen as a cook, which makes absolutely no sense if you knew my father, but that was his job. And this was a letter that the children's home wrote back to the police. And what it says is that because of this kid's experience, his nerves are so shot that he can't do this job. But he's a nice kid and he's a smart kid. We want to keep him, but we just want to keep him in a different capacity, and we're going to cut his salary, and is it okay? And the police wrote back, yes, you can keep him. And the reason all this went through the police is, for some reason in Switzerland, the entire child refugee program during the war was administered by the police. Anyway, so he's in Switzerland, he gets moved around, living in a lot of different places. The war finally ends in 1945. I told you my father's parents, they did get out. They actually made it to England in 1939. So while my father's living in France and moving around France and Switzerland, his parents are in London this whole time. The war ends. You'd think my father would go to England to reunite with his parents. He didn't. He actually went to Palestine. It was not yet Israel. It didn't become Israel until 1948. He went to Palestine. He worked on a kibbutz. He stayed there for about 9 months, and he absolutely hated it. He said it was so socialist. He says his parents sent him airmail stamps so he could write letters to them in England, and the kibbutz, they confiscated them. He said, you can't own that. That belongs to the kibbutz. Anyway, he's there about 9 months, and in 1946, he finally makes the journey to London and he reunites with his parents. He, excuse me, he spends about 2 years in London. He's living with his parents. He learns English. He didn't speak English when he went there. He had various jobs. And then in 1948, 2 years later, my father comes to America. He comes first. He sails to New York. This is actually the ship manifest of his sailing from Liverpool to New York. He gets set up. He gets an apartment in New York City. If you know New York City, it was in Washington Heights, which is northern Manhattan. So he gets set up, and then his parents follow him. And the rest is kind of, as we say, history. Came to America in 1948. He met my mother in 1951. They dated for about 3 months, and then they got married. My brother was born almost exactly 9 months later. I'll let you all do the math on that. And my father really built a great life in America for himself and his family. And he stayed in New York until the late 80s. He moved to Dallas in 1989, where I was living. And then, he died about 13 years ago in 2007. A note about my grandparents, and then we can wrap this up and take your questions. The German government paid a lot of money in restitution to people that lost property and jobs in Germany and fled. My grandparents ended up suing. They filed 2 lawsuits in Germany after the war. They filed, one was a lawsuit against the German government for restitution. The German government had offered them some money. My grandfather didn't think it was fair and adequate, so he sued the government. And there was another lawsuit filed. My grandparents owned an apartment building. They didn't live in it, but they owned it and they rented it out. And they sold it under duress in 1938, and they sued the couple that bought that building from them. Anyway, this is a copy of the lawsuit that they filed. And this is what the family became. My father survived. He now became, he had 2 kids, so that's 2 of us. I have 2 kids. And these are just some pictures of the family. This one, that's a picture of me at my bar mitzvah when I was 13 years old. These are my kids when they were, I think, 2 years old. That's a picture of my dad holding, I think it's my son as a newborn. These are those 2-year-old kids a few years ago. They're now 32 years old. This is my daughter's law school graduation. And this is a picture from my son's wedding. And that's just a picture of my dad and I. Anyway, I really just have one final thought that I want to leave with you. We go to high school. Many of us went to college, and many of us went to graduate school. This experience that I've just told you about, this was really my father's high school and college. Was really being in hiding and then escaping to Switzerland and having these odd jobs. He kind of missed that whole part of his life. So anyway, that's all I have. We'll take questions, and I want to thank you all very much for attending this.
Thanks so much, Ron. We do have some questions for you. So our first one mentions there was a photo in the early slideshow of Leggett, of your father and some other kids, but the bottom right, there was a photo that looked like a reunion. Would you be able to talk about that? Was that a reunion of the kids later?
So yeah, I will tell you, it was a reunion of the Leggett kids. They've actually had a few reunions. Almost all the Leggett kids survived. 10 of them actually did get deported, and 9 of them perished at Auschwitz. But yeah, there were still another 120 kids that survived, living all over the world, many in the US, a lot in Israel. And yeah, they've had several reunions over the years. And that was a picture from the reunion.
Very good. Donna would like to know how your grandparents ended up in England. How were they able to escape Germany?
I don't know a lot about my grandparents' escape. I suspect that before my grandfather did the inventory of the jewelry store, he put a lot of goods in his pocket. And my father told me that, I mean, they didn't care where they went. They just wanted to get out of Germany, and they were able to get a visa for England. My father believed that they pretty much bribed their way out with jewelry, getting the papers to leave.
Got it. We have a question. Do you know, I guess, how your grandparents found out about Leggett, how they managed to get your father a spot at the school?
I have a theory. I don't know for certain. And my father didn't know anything about the people who were responsible for him and watching over him. And that was very intentional, right? If my father got picked up, they didn't want him to be able to give anyone else up. But here's what I think. There was and is an organization called OSE. It stands for Oeuvre de Secours aux Enfants, if you know any French, which is basically children's relief agency. And they're dedicated to helping Jewish children, and it still exists today. There was a guy who worked for them named George Loignet, and he was looking for kids, German and Austrian kids, to save Jewish kids, and he was looking for children of parents who had been interned in the concentration camps. When my grandfather was arrested at Kristallnacht and sent to Dachau, that my family got on George's radar, and that he approached my grandmother to talk to him about repatriating my father. And so we think that was the journey. And he had a connection to Leggett. His wife was a teacher there, and he saved something like 130 kids, and that was their first stop. He sent them all to Leggett.
Got it. Was your dad able to stay in touch with his parents at all while he was in hiding in France, or how did they end up reconnecting, I guess? How did he find out they were in England and then find out where he was?
Yeah, that's probably the most common question I get. So for almost all the time in France, except for about 6 or 8 months, they were able to write letters to each other. There was still mail. Like I said, except for this 6 or 8 month period. So my father knew that his parents were in England, and they pretty much knew where he was in France all the time, except for, like I said, this 6 or 8 month period, which must have been terrifying for them. They didn't know if he was alive or not, or what happened to him. But no phone calls. I mean, just letters.
Yeah, good. How did you obtain all these documents and photographs that you have now, or copies of? I know you mentioned you did some research in various archives, but can you talk a little bit more about that process?
Yeah, I have a lot of documents, and it's really been a labor of love. You start scratching your head and you go to one place, And like I started with the German National Library in Leipzig. And they, make a long story short, they say, well, we have this, but contact this person here. And then you contact them and they send you somewhere else. So most of the documents that I have really came from that process, from asking people and them giving me what they had and referring me to other people. So I've been to various archives in Germany and gotten documents there. I've been to various archives and museums in France and gotten documents there. The Swiss had an entire file of on my father, I think almost 90 different documents that they sent to me for a small fee. So yeah, you sort of scratch your head and you ask, and there's a lot out there.
Go on the journey.
Germans, with all the terrible things that they did, they were great record keepers, and they kept really good records.
Did your father talk about his experiences when you were younger, when you were growing up, or did it take longer to kind of learn this history of his?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. My father was always willing to talk about his story, and I actually think he enjoyed talking about it. We used to go, my father we also lived in New York. My grandparents lived in New York City, and every Sunday, my father would go have lunch with his parents, and I would go with him, and I'd ride the 40 minutes in the car. And I can't tell you how many times I would say to him, Dad, tell me that story again, tell me that story again. And he would tell me. He didn't mind talking about it.
We have an interesting question. If you've ever encountered Holocaust deniers in your experiences, and if you haven't, how would you respond to someone who approaches you and denies that this happened?
Holocaust deniers. I would say, are you effing kidding me? No. Holocaust denial is interesting, at least in America, because what you don't see in America, you don't see Holocaust denials existing on its own. Holocaust deniability in America, at least, tends to be part of the white supremacist movement. And it's just a part of that, that they hate Jews and they hate Black people, and right, there's a long list. And it's really, quite honestly, it's really hard to know what to say to them, because these people believe that they will tell you they don't hate anyone. But they think that other groups are inferior, and they have these PhDs feeding them statistics, and they believe that what they believe is based on science. For example, if you look at the disproportionate number of COVID cases that Black people get compared to other groups, well, they would look at that and say, you see, Black people are biologically inferior to us, rather than digging deeper under the surface and understanding why that is the case. And that, of course, it has nothing to do with biological differences, has more to do with socioeconomic. So the truth is, to answer your question, I know I'm not going to convince a Holocaust denier. I may ask him some questions. I'm not going to get angry at him. And I don't know, maybe I can say something that resonates with them, but probably not.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question before we wrap up. What inspired you to speak for the museum, to other groups, to tell your father's story?
For me, I think we all wear different hats. We all have multiple identities. Like, I'm a dad, I'm an employer, I'm a boyfriend, and I am also the son of a Holocaust survivor. It's part of how I think about myself. And I have always thought about myself that way. This is part of my identity. So I'm so connected to this story. I love the story. I think, what my father went through obviously was terrible, but it had a happy ending. I think there's a lot of hopefulness in his story because of the happy ending. And I think it's important to keep telling the story and let people know, not just because of the Holocaust deniers, but just because of Holocaust naivete. Something like 1/3 of millennials have never heard of the Holocaust. 2/3 of millennials have never heard of Auschwitz. I mean, we have a serious educational deficiency. And so I love telling my father's story. I feel like I'm educating people, and I feel like I'm honoring my father at the same time. So, it's just a win-win-win for me to do this.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ron. We really appreciate you taking the time today. I'll just mention to everyone, we have one last event in our Summer Survivor Speaker Series next Tuesday with Julie Berman, one of our wonderful second-generation speakers. We hope you'll join us. And as always, you can visit our website, dhhrm.org, for all of our upcoming programs. Everyone have a great rest of your day. Stay well, stay safe, and we'll see you next time.